Woodrow Wilson was a well-educated scholar, though his personality led him to be seen as cold and distant by the people of America. In his writings, he expressed his belief that the U.S. Constitution was a document that was open to corruption. His view on foreign policy was mainly isolationist, but he recognized the need for internationalism. Through his presidency, which lasted from 1913 to 1921.
Wilson's economic policies. When Wilson was elected in 1913, the economy was well stimulated, but he thought it to be in need of maintenance. Wilson established himself with his New Freedom agenda, which sought to lower tariffs by reducing tax rates and replacing lost revenue with the federal income tax, which still affects wage earners across the country. Restructuring the banking system with the Federal Reserve Act, which created 12 regional banks to stifle intimidation from the powerful banks of New York, and by displacing big business entities with the Federal Trade Act of 1914, which induced competition among businesses and reduced unjust trade practices so as to regulate business. Wilson boldly denounced corporate lobbyists and supported tax labor unions, which was supported by the Democrat-run Congress of his New Freedom campaign. The Federal Farm Loan Act lowered the cost of long-term mortgages to farmers, while the Lever Act supervised agriculture and food production, also providing new efficient farming techniques to farmers. In diplomatic effort, Wilson also borrowed millions of dollars to enable the Allies to finance themselves through World War I. The antitrust legislation, which Wilson established in 1914, made price discrimination illegal among businesses and allowed for strikes, picketing, and boycotting of unjust business practices.
Political policies of Wilson. In 1913, a U.S. naval crew was imprisoned in the Mexican city of Tampico. Wilson ordered U.S. soldiers to occupy Veracruz, Mexico, starting a conflict that claimed the lives of 126 Mexicans and 19 Americans. A coal miners' strike in 1914 turned violent, causing the deaths of several people, including 11 children, in what was known as the Ludlow Massacre. Wilson ordered the military to stop the violence, showing support for labor unions. During the early years of World War I, Wilson made many attempts to foster peace between the two sides. Neither seemed interested, and he abandoned the venture. After the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted in 1917, Wilson cut all political ties with Germany. In March of 1917, he called a cabinet meeting where the decision to go to war was unanimous. In 1918, Wilson gave a speech announcing his 14 points. These points outlined his views on what should be done with Europe post-war.
Woodrow Wilson's social impact. The people who first nominated Woodrow Wilson as a candidate thought that he would just be a puppet for their party, but Wilson held a firm stance on what he believed and proved to be a strong-willed president. When he campaigned for the presidency, he did it on a program called New Freedom, in which he outlined his ideas on individualism and states' rights. He often fought to break all trusts and diminish all tariffs because he believed that tariffs protected industrialists at the expense of small farmers. Woodrow Wilson was also responsible for the passage of many social reforms and laws, such as the Keating-Owen Act, which was the first federal child labor law. It prohibited the sale of goods from factories that employed children younger than 16, though the law ultimately failed when the Supreme Court of the United States declared it unconstitutional. Wilson also passed legislation that supported unions in order to give more power to the working class. This improved the public's opinion of him because he fought the big companies for the little people. Also in 1916, Wilson nominated Louise Brandeis, a strong progressive who had fought in the court against the exploitation of women and children workers. He also put the first Jewish justice in court. He was very much a man of the people.
FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a true man of the people. His expert guidance and charismatic qualities helped the American people through a time of great hardship. He devised methods to rehabilitate the American economy and the moral of the people. In contrast to Woodrow Wilson, FDR was absolutely adored by the people and was seen as a brilliant leader with a down-to-earth view on matters. He won a record 4 elections, his presidency lasting from 1933 to 1945. FDR's economic policies. The New Deal. This was meant to eliminate the factors which ultimately caused America's Great Depression. This included acts and laws that increased the federal government's involvement in the economy. This plan had 3 prongs, which are commonly identified as FDR's 3 main goals for the economy. Relief, which focused on making government jobs to reduce unemployment rates. Recovery, which stressed the need for the economy to return to normal through the passing of various acts, and reform, the financial system was the primary concern in this prong, so as to obviate the reoccurrence of a depression in the future. The Works Progress Administration was the largest New Deal agency and employed millions of unskilled workers to build public structures like roads, bridges, and parks. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a New Deal law that aimed to reduce agricultural production by paying farmers not to plant on part of their land and to kill off excess livestock. The National Labor Relations Act was an act guaranteeing private sector employees the right to organize into labor unions and to engage in collective bargaining for better working conditions.
FDR's political policies. FDR's most impactful political decisions centered around the Second World War. Good neighbor policy. Foreign policy of FDR's administration stated a policy of non-intervention in the affairs of Latin American countries. Lend-Lease Act. It was enacted in March of 1941, and this act provided Allied nations with supplies such as weapons, oil, and food. On December 8, 1941, FDR asked Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan following their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor the previous day. The Manhattan Project. On October 9, 1941, FDR approved the project. The Manhattan Project would later produce the first atomic bombs, which would later be used on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Franklin D. Roosevelt's social impact. FDR came into power when the United States was going through crippling depression. The president before him, Herbert Hoover, held philosophies that did not apply to the situation, therefore he exacerbated the situation even more. After President Hoover, the people longed for a president who would take charge and help the country out of depression. When FDR campaigned for the presidency, he did it under the pretense that his presidency would bring change. In his first term, he asked Congress into 2 emergency sessions, each one about 100 days in length, and pushed a series of legislation through it each time which created the major acts and administrative bodies of the New Deal. Roosevelt addressed the nation and let them know what was going on about the Depression. 3 major initiatives represented the administration's political turn to the left. The Workers' Progress Administration, WPA, the Wagner-Connery National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner's Act for short, and the Social Security Act. Americans were receiving WPA checks for building schools, hospitals, and airports, and for pursuing cultural projects in theater, music, literature, and history. The National Youth Administration, the NYA, an agency of the WPA, trained and employed hundreds of thousands of teenagers and made it possible for more young people to work their way through college. FDR also supported the Wagner-Connery National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed labor unions the right to organize and bargain collectively, and established the National Labor Relations Board to enforce these rights. However, FDR's policies did not support all factions of American life. African Americans and Mexican Americans were often left out and were not eligible for old age pension.
Contrasts. While Roosevelt, like his cousin Teddy, was a realist, Wilson was an idealist. Roosevelt's expectations were realistic. He knew he could not solve the economic crisis completely, but he gave the people hope. By contrast, Wilson strived to actually achieve goals that were not as tangible. His 14 points, while they did show what an ideal post-war world would look like, failed to come into any kind of fruition. Comparisons. Both Roosevelt and Wilson had an agenda of social and economic reform. These presidents both had to deal with the World War, and neither of them wished to enter it immediately. Like FDR in his first 100 days, Wilson had a Congress dominated by his own party, the Democratic Party.
Verdict. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is remembered today as one of the most influential presidents in all of American history. Woodrow Wilson, though he achieved some magnificent feats during his presidency, is not remembered as well or as fondly. Thus, FDR had more of an impact on America and the world. His brilliant leadership led America through some of the toughest times in her history and dug her out of a deep pit she dug herself.